All right, here we're at the next installment of my critique of politics after Christendom, and we're at chapter 7 now. If we have to do it, I think that's the way we'll do it the rest of the way, is just by chapters. But this is on pluralism and religious liberty, and as I've had before, I have on the board here the Noahic Covenant, and all this is going to represent is other secular or common, as he'll use the word common spheres, but we'll just say secular civil governments that follow. But we're going to have this flowchart from Genesis 9 to Genesis 10 and 11 because there's something that I don't think is factored in. But pluralism and religious liberty. And what Van Drunen does, to be fair, is that he shows some balance. And basically he recognizes that a society's complete openness is an impossibility. There's jails. There has to be some borders and lines. But the universality of the Noahic Covenant, in his mind, prescribes a maximal degree of diversity. So in this case, a maximal degree of religious pluralism. So this sets a low bar for human participation. He acknowledges that violence against life in Genesis 9, 5, and 6 can be extended to deny other proportionately lesser parts of life. So for example, I've done this on the board before and I'll do it again. This is an image of God. He's got a shovel in his hand. He's not engaging in violence, but he has in himself life, liberty, and now property. That's an extension of his being. That's the way John Locke would have put it. That's the way Frederic Bastiat would have put it if you're familiar in more libertarian circles. And there's two things that can come against that. You've got this other guy that comes in here and he doesn't have a shovel, or maybe he's wielding a shovel as a knife, but you get the idea. He's got a gun. Doesn't matter what he's got. And we're going to put two other words, force, and another word that he's going to recognize, fraud. So you could tell that Van Drunen has read his classical liberal theorists. He would recognize these same kind of things. And as Locke himself argued in the second treatise on government, if it is true, in the old Lex Talionis, if it is true that life for life, that's proportionate, then if you take liberty, if you enslave, or if you engage in theft, then this person could go to jail, not just capital punishment, but jail, or pay a fine, something that is proportionate to that which he took away by violence. And so there's a counter violence, a good violence, that God has ordained Noah and all his sons. So far, so good. Nonetheless, Van Drunen is moving closer to what I'm going to call a right view. Very technical term. Not really, because what I want to do is I want to avoid this caricature and this false dilemma between either we have a Christian view of politics, which I'm for, but Van Drunen is going to try to pigeonhole that as basically a theonomic view, what he's going to call mixing the prerogatives of the holy community and the Abrahamic and imposing that by force on a non-Christian community on the common sphere. I want to say, stop. There's a third option. If your natural law argument is correct, then that is really just another way to say the right view. Now, as we're going to see in the red writing that'll follow, there's a problem with simply saying, because again, Van Drunen is not your father or grandfather's pietism. It's not just the strict anti-intellectualism that ignores natural law and that does not argue for some right view. He's familiar with those authors. But what he wants to do is push back against dominionism, theonomy, having a Christian magistrate impose Christian values on the secular community. So what he's going to do is, in spite of having that set up, he's going to add things like two things: racial identity and religious profession that cannot function as disqualifiers. This guy can be disqualified. He's going to jail. I think we all agree on that. But what if he simply had a different religion, whatever that is? Let's put a some kind of a religious robe on him of some sort, but it's not Christian. Can we exclude him? Okay. Now we understand the racial identity argument, or do we? I mean, that's a whole other class, is kinism on the other extreme. But Van Drunen might be on another extreme, because one of the things that happens at Babel is these guys start spinning off into chaos. However, against the kinist, we would say that when God made that separation in nations, it was not on the basis of skin color or skin tone. Now, that came with it as time went on in the development of that. But what was the break? Did he, at Babel, did God snap his hands and make people different colors? No. What he did do was he scattered them according to what? Language. And then that issued forth into their differences of culture and so forth. Then, if you want to, then that was organized. Race was connected to that, if by race you mean skin color. Okay? But now Van Drunen is going to be all the way on the other extreme and say, if his view is consistent, then you cannot exclude people by different racial identities. Now, how far do you take that? So was God in sin when he scattered? So that's sort of the other extreme. And Van Drunen, of course, would say no, but he would say that's different. Okay, but now, in the modern world, now that we're here, would it be wrong for a group to exist? You'd have to argue that the more pluralistic scheme, the American scheme, is more inherently righteous precisely because you have this melting pot, and then other nations in the third world. Typically, the people that do this won't go around to the third world and start wagging their finger and saying, now, you African tribes or you Asian groups, who are obviously very much more alike in their skin color, but nevertheless very different in traditions and so forth. They typically wouldn't go around judging those cultures. They only want to judge Western cultures, which I think is very telling. But part of what Van Drunen is doing is he's laying the foundation for not confusing the sword and the keys. In other words, one other way to say it, not confusing the first table of the law with the second table of the law. In other words, this is a common sphere. If you fast forward to Israel, the first table of the law, namely commandments 1 through 4, those regard worship. Those are ecclesial law versus, now he hasn't even said anything about the second table of the law yet in terms of, but you have to if you're in the Presbyterian Reformed tradition, because their own confessional standards are going to say that the moral law is summarily comprehended in the Ten Commandments. And that is, to say it generously, overlapping with the natural law. I say it's the same substance as the natural law, because Paul does in Romans 2:14. Okay, that's the basic lay of the land and the basic problem. Pluralism. So let's handle this in a couple of questions. Question 1, what is wrong with viewing the Noahic Covenant as pluralistic? Well, the Noahic Covenant is universal in its audience. We agree. However, that does imply that it is an audience, first and foremost. In other words, political mankind here is a divinely called assembly. This guy and these guys are called into this assembly. Let us call it common or universal if you like. But they are called, the shape of it is divinely shaped in form. And if you tear that from its context as a mandate from God, it loses its objective nature, even while retaining its universal nature. So you say it has a universal scope. Question, what has a universal scope? Any old thing? This is God commanding what that shape is. So in other words, to define this universality in terms of the plurality or the diversity, you start to lose that objective shape. You say, no, it doesn't, because everybody can agree. And I'm going to break the red pen out. Babel, not so. This is less about Babel, but let's put a word up here that Van Tillians will love, and we actually don't disagree with him about this. And that is, let's use the other red pen that I got over here, a new red pen. but make it nice and big, this word antithesis. And let's draw it as an arrow coming in this way. A sharp, giant arrow threatening the image of God. To define this universality in terms of maximizing the diversity ignores the antithesis of sinful man to the spirit of that covenant, and it is to elevate the plurality over the universal, to join the forces of the rebellious pluralities against any semblance of what was so universal. I think one of the things that you'll see very quickly as you start to read Van Drunen is everything's building so reasonable like the Western tradition, but this is not taken seriously. So we're not really even talking about something, in a sense, distinctly Christian, as a Van Tillian might want to press. We're just saying life, liberty, and property. And Van Drunen might say, exactly. As if that's so agreed upon. Because it's not. Not for the reason the Van Tillians give, that these common notions, this common ground, is unintelligible, but rather simply because these people are demon-possessed and they hate the image of God. On that point, we can agree with the Van Tillians against Van Drunen. That sin causes the majority of people, if left to their own devices, and in particularly when that sin is harnessed by ideology that is dead set against not just life, liberty, and property, but then the institutions that stand in between the image of God and the state, principally the family, but also labor, and also the very notion of law and religion. In other words, all the things that Marx built up in this construct, the false consciousness, and all these things that were props of the bourgeoisie that needed to be deconstructed. That's not just something we can all just agree on. We can't all just agree on that. So it becomes a problem. And so to put some flesh on this, all of this is really just a theological scheme for the problem of elevating. Just to give one example, but I think it really strikes at the heart. When you elevate something, for example, like the right to vote, up here, because above the rights of life, liberty, and property. So having a share in the state, namely with the right to vote, becomes more important or even equal to the very foundation of the state, its reason for existing, which is to defend life, liberty, and property. So beyond that, a study of history, a study of the logic of the various world religions and ideologies, in other words, all the diverse things. Now let's let this not stand for the nations that come afterwards, ... Now let's let them stand for different ideologies and different cultures invading. Don't think of that principally as immigration. I'm sure that's what some people would want that to represent. It can come in that form, and that is what the multiculturalists have in their mind. They are trying to, but think of this only in terms of ideology. Why do I say ideology? Well, because you might want to make this just about other world religions. I want to allow the maximum, didn't the Founding Fathers want to do that? The maximum amount of world religions, which by the way they didn't, even those deists understood that that's unreasonable, that's cultural suicide. Because what I want to suggest is that if you want to hide behind the word religion, we understand that about how atheism, in a sense, is a religion. Atheists don't like that. That secular humanism is a religion. So call it an ideology, call it a religion. The point is, it is a view that what we're suggesting is that it is an inherently violent view. That these views are either intentionally antagonistic to natural rights, or else they are philosophically, best case scenario, they are philosophically and educationally incompetent to inculcate the prerequisite knowledge of those rights to defend and to maintain that civilization. The sheer confusion of cultures at any given historic moment There's this sociologist in the early 20th century that referred to this as the vertical invasion of the barbarians. In other words, there was not enough cultural capital, maybe not enough teachers, maybe not enough people well versed in the classics to absorb the glut, the demand, you might say, of uncultured peoples bursting onto the historic scene at a particular time to absorb them into that culture. We saw that even within our own country, nothing less to do with color or anything like that, or even economic status, but simply at the end of World War II, when all of a sudden after World War I, turn to the 20th century with universal suffrage, women's rights, everybody now had the right to a decent education. And then in World War II, in addition to that, you had the GI Bill, and you had other things that made, before the 20th century, most people simply did not go to college and then to graduate school and so on. They were done when they were in 8th grade, and they did what Dad did after that. Unless they wanted to be a lawyer, doctor, clergyman, or whatever, and then you'd go to further school and so forth. Well, now it's a universal right. Well, do you have the supply of people versed in the classical culture that can absorb these people into the terms and conditions of being a human? And if your answer is no, then you're going to have this vertical invasion of the barbarians, and you're going to have at least the possibility of that antithesis being exploded as kindling, and then the ideology, Marxism, comes in as a match that you strike in that very convenient setting. I don't think Van Drunen takes this into consideration. I know he doesn't, all right? Secondly, how does he resolve the dilemma of pluralism and the common good? Now, he recognizes that while many have held to a notion of a common good, it is difficult to see how there could be such good in a genuine pluralistic society. So he begins with a rather weak thesis. On page 187, quote, "A political community needs some shared moral vision, but its vision need not be substantively rich in order to sustain a peaceful coexistence." I think you need a substantially rich rationale for stopping this blade coming at you. You wouldn't think so. I mean, who would be for, like what Hitler did? We're all against that, aren't we? If you have a substantively rich reason to be against it, yes. If not, no. Then you're silly putty in the hands of the demagogue. Okay? So that's crucially important. He speaks of a bare minimum of, there's 3 values that Van Drunen sees, and they sound conservative. And so people are reading this, and he talks about these 3, pillars or whatever of a society. There has to be families for the sake of procreation. There has to be enterprise institutions, and there has to be courts for the rule of law. Family, free enterprise, rule of law sounds like a conservative. And indeed, those are certainly the structures. Those are the institutions. But then he allows on page 188 a wide berth to the judgment of the community's diverse people as to how these institutions will take shape. How wide? Like Disney wide? Because Disney might not have been on your radar screen 20 years ago. So how wide are we talking about here? How wide of a judgment? How diverse on their form? So, for example, if you think the property is theft, can we agree on protection of property rights? Or will we have a mostly peaceful disagreement about that one particular summer, hypothetically speaking? Question 3, what is his argument for religious liberty? Does he see it as a natural right? It's interesting, he clearly prefers the modern authors, such as Castellio, who went against Calvin, Pierre Bayle, Milton, Locke, Roger Williams, specifically against the views of Augustine and Calvin. And I think we can maybe disagree with Augustine. If you've ever read like Peter Brown's biography of Augustine and others, what he did with the Donatists may not be completely evident in his writing, but if you see it in the historical context, the language of compelling them and so forth, and it's just the classic what you hear about the Christian tradition. And you can disagree with elements of Augustine there, and he disagrees with Calvin as well. You'll hear this, by the way, in their not as loud voice about how the Reformed tradition as a whole never really, at least in the 16th, 17th centuries, never really got out of Christendom. They were still intoxicated with power and the state church settlement and so forth. They have to, because they don't talk today like the reformers did in those first 2 centuries. Van Drunen urges that we don't argue for religious liberty in the way that, for example, Robert George does, on the ground that religion is an intrinsic good, because his reason, well, Romans 1 teaches us that not all religions are intrinsically good. We agree, but while he consciously avoids calling the state secular rather than religious, the nature of the Noahic Covenant demands something like the First Amendment's Establishment Clause and its Free Exercise Clause. So free exercise of religion. By the way, the Establishment Clause is often, you can't really understand it unless you understand the whole system of federalism to begin with, because at that time, 9 of the 13 colonies had established religions. It was really just speaking to the federal level. But that's neither here nor there, because his whole point is that the common sphere should maximally, as much as possible, include as many religions free to express themselves as possible. Now, somebody could hear all this and object and say, now look, Van Drunen is not so subjective here. He allows what he calls the harm principle. And that's what I was referring to here by force and fraud. The harm principle, okay? And it's going to be pretty obvious and straightforward what that means. He's not just letting in any religion here, but on the grounds of force and fraud against life and property. Now, it's true. Van Drunen does allow for that. It's interesting, his exclusion of liberty at this point from intrinsically being in the image of God. I at least make a note of that, because that's in style today, is to suggest that rights in general, for Christians to even speak of rights, is a very Enlightenment thing, and that especially liberty. And you see that in debates about masks and vax and all these different things, that it's such a petty thing, such a first world problem. Well, beyond that, it has to be asked, what if a viewpoint, religious or otherwise, what if a viewpoint makes violence against life or property their very creed? In other words, it's not just, oops, I committed a genocide again. It's not that sort of thing. It's like in their book. And if you had just read their book before they came to power, they kind of told you what they were going to do. Because Marxism just is violence against that. The majority interpretation of Islam is like that. Are they to be excluded? If so, how soon? As they're coming this way? Or when the genocide happens? Once the body bags start stacking up? Or by having the good sense to read their creed and to see that this is what they intend from the start? So, again, as I said, even the Founding Fathers understood that, deist though many of them may have been. Question 4. So, is it not morally permissible, you might be asking, to form a commonwealth out of a Christian consensus? Notice that I didn't even yet say a Christian prince, which would almost be necessary in that context, but we're not talking about whether or not they're saved, or, questions about people like Constantine and so forth, which is really just a rabbit trail, really. But can you have a commonwealth that is decidedly motivated by Christian consensus? And is that what that is with Noah? Because it's common to all mankind, but that it is to mankind, that still begs a lot of questions about that antithesis. For Van Drunen, quote, page 201, when a political community grounded in the Noahic Covenant weds itself to a particular religion or a particular religious body, it adds a priestly dimension to its royal rule. This, I conclude, usurps a divine privilege granted only to the church. So did you hear that? Let me just read that one more time so you can start to see the point of separation. If it's not been clear to you so far, it's like, what? He's for natural law. What? He's for life, liberty, and property. He force and fraud. It's like he's almost like he's read Bastiat. I mean, he gets it. What's the problem? Read it again. When a political community grounded in the Noahic Covenant weds itself to a particular religion, first of all, have your equivocation antennas up. What does that even mean? Weds itself to a particular religion or religious body. It adds a priestly dimension to its royal rule. Adds, or does he actually mean conflate? Because I think he's conflating with conflating. It adds a priestly dimension to its royal rule. This, I conclude, usurps a divine privilege granted only to the church. So there's the basic logic that starts to make plain how Van Druenen's concept of natural law and civil society deviates from the traditional Western view, in fact, from the traditional Reformed view. Here's the logic. If religious grounding, then a priestly function. No, it's not what he said. He said if it weds itself. Oh, sure, he said it. What does he mean by it? First of all, what does that mean if it's wedding to a particular... So if there's a Christian consensus to protect Christians, for example, to protect the church, oh, but it gives them special privileges. I'll come to that in a second. Special privileges, exemptions, things like that. But if religious grounding of a particular religion, then a priestly function. Really? That wasn't even true of Israel. I mean, when it was true, that person was usurping, as Uzziah, when he tried to take the priestly functions to himself as the king. And, so that happened in Israel, but when it happened, it was recognized as sin. The offices in and of themselves did not necessarily disallow distinction. Now, there was unity of them sometimes. For example, in Moses or in Samuel, and the kings had some priestly prophetic duties and so forth. Having said that, there was still distinction. So it didn't erase the distinction. It doesn't follow that you must erase the distinction in order to have a Christian consensus, for example. Okay? Doesn't mean, I can't tell my priest from my king because I'm a Christian, so I'm like less able to do that than a pagan. That's absurd. Okay? So that is what he means by those words, even if he's not drawing it out. Just understand here that Van Druenen conflates the protection or patronage of a church by the state with the traditional views wedding of sword and keys or kingly and priestly offices. If my state offers protection to the church as the church, maybe even marriage is marriage. Oh, he's not saying that. Okay, but in order to uphold marriage, you're going to have to, prepare for that, because I think that's the next chapter anyway. Then I am conflating keys and sword. Okay? This is question begging at best, if not equivocation and non sequitur at worst. And that brings up the last question. What about religious exemptions to general laws? He covers that in the last part of the chapter. He divides the priority of general laws over claims to religious exemption into two categories. Number one, laws causing private parties to act contrary to their convictions, say if you're a cake baker or a photographer of weddings. Two, laws hindering a religious body or governing its internal affairs. So, for example, if only straight marriage is on the menu at your church or something to that effect. Or worshiping without masks, or worshiping at all in the early, worshiping without singing. You believe that? We forget that. Just 2 years ago, Illinois and California. Yeah, but you can't sing. What? And no, because then that's the state telling, and in some cases the Lord's Supper, restricting a sacrament. Okay? So you had to wrestle through those issues and think about it. It's like, wait a minute, I'm basically saying that the state is over the church, i.e. is taking over for the church in this case. Now, the rationale used in such cases, always, no matter which side they fall on, is balancing out the law's burden on the private party versus the state's interest. So it raises the question, what is the state's interest in this religious matter or with these people that are defining themselves in some religious way? Van Druenen recognizes inherent problems, and they are. to granting religious exemptions in a pluralistic society. If you want to exalt the plurality here, that creates problems with religious exemptions. But he doesn't seem to think that the problem is sufficient to make it unjust. What kind of problems? Well, here's the way I would put it, even if he does not put it that way. Now, he does bring all these up, but I want to say it in my way, because I want to put a sharp focus on it so you could say, oh yeah, that's kind of unavoidable. How are courts to determine what constitutes a religious exemption from a non-religious exemption? A religious exemption from a non-religious exemption. Or, you say, well, that's easy enough. Okay. Why, the non-religious person says, why the latter should not be the same as the former. In other words, an atheist comes up to you and says, why shouldn't I have the same exemption that he has from the draft or from this vaccine or whatever it is? Why not? Or whether one who qualifies for an exemption in principle is not simply feigning religious grounds to avoid what would otherwise be obligatory. The famous case of Muhammad Ali not serving in Vietnam. I don't know if you ever watched this, but there was an interview. William F. Buckley had Muhammad Ali on the firing line right after Ali had served his jail time. And as much as I'm a fan of William F. Buckley, part of me sympathized with Ali's argument. At a certain point, you basically have to say that he's faking it. Or that Muslims have no right to exempt themselves. Or that Christians never would, which some Christian denominations would say, that's not true. But what does that require? Who's making this decision? Well, the state is. But what would the state need to know to make these kind of decisions? What we don't seem to understand here is that the problem actually goes down to the very root of this kind of a mixture. Such civil magistrates must not only know the religions in question, they must not only know those religions enough, but rule for one against another, or one principle in each religion over other principles in those religions. They're doing exegesis. They must be, in other words, theologians, taking sides in what are irreducibly theological matters. Have you ever heard the expression, everyone's a theologian? Did you actually mean that? Because you actually should have. Because in order to say that this in relation to this, and this in relation to this, and yes, you count, no, you don't, yes, this counts within your thing, but this thing doesn't count as the same thing within your thing. Oh, how quickly we're calling them thingies now. But before you just wanted to call them all world religions, not this. But then, put a crown on him. He's the magistrate. But then he is ruling between these, or between principles in them. He's being an exegete, a theologian, in order to do this. And you might want to fight that and say, no, he's not. Because we're talking about a very, 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 very low common denominator. But the lower you want to put that, the less argument you have against the violence that comes against this. Sorry for the messy board here, but hopefully you get the idea. Anyway, that's chapter 7 on, it's really about toleration at some level, but behind that it's about pluralism and religious liberty is the name of the chapter. And in the next chapter we'll talk more about the family. And the family and commerce, I believe, is the next chapter. So that's next time.